Hello, everyone. My name is Mr. Charles. This is Upbeat Academy, Ableton Online Lessons. This is our lesson about MIDI. I hope that everyone is doing well today and that you find this series educational. Last week we discussed audio tracks and how audio tracks can be used to create compositions utilizing pre-existing audio and loops. We can manipulate the audio using audio effects or using the clip editing modes that we have in Ableton. Today we're going to go over MIDI and how to use a MIDI track to compose a drum loop, and then we're going to use the audio melodies that we have as well as an 808 to create a track. I hope everyone's doing well and you find this tutorial very educational. So let's begin. All right. So, MIDI tracks. When we boot up Ableton, typically we start out with 4 tracks. We have 2 MIDI, 2 audio, then we have 2 return tracks. If you have the standard edition or the light edition, typically it's going to show up as a reverb and a delay and then this master channel. What we're going to do today is we're going to select these channels that we're not going to use and we're going to delete them. So I'm clicking on them with my mouse and then pressing delete, because the most important thing when creating is making sure that we have a welcoming and comfortable environment. So MIDI is a mysterious type of track type to a lot of people who have not created before. MIDI stands for musical instrument digital interface. And really, it just means that notes that are played into a program can be exported as clips and placed into other places. If you've ever been to a restaurant where they have a self-playing piano, that's a really good example of MIDI, because the way that self-playing pianos work is it's fed a sheet that has notes punched out so that when it goes around, the piano notes will move in sequence with the paper. MIDI is the same thing. If you create a MIDI file in any DAW, you can export it and use it in another DAW. DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation. So any digital audio workstation that can import or export MIDI, you can use this lesson. What we're going to do is we're going to make our own MIDI clip that contains all of our drum information, all of our percussion information in our beat. But what does MIDI look like? Well, what I did for a number of my students here in New Orleans is I went and recreated popular songs. So this one song contained, as far as the drums, a hi-hat, a clap, a kick, a snare, a open hat, or what is called a perk in a lot of drum kits, and an 808. As far as the melody is concerned, there is the main piano part and then 2 harmonic layers, right? And if I press play, one thing you'll notice is that my original track tempo was 120 beats per minute. And if let's delete all these, watch my tempo. When I drag this MIDI information in, it automatically changes it to 134 beats per minute. And that is dictated based on this MIDI file here. This MIDI file contains all of these notes. Look at that. So if I press play, you'll notice this MIDI file. If we go to in the file and we show this in the file tree, I want you to take a look at this. It's very small. It's smaller than any of the other files in this order. There's all the rest of the files are almost triple the size of the MIDI file, but the MIDI file contains all this information, because the MIDI file is like sheet music for your music programs. So if I press play, you're not going to hear anything. Look, it's moving, but you don't hear any notes. And the reason for that is the MIDI information tells us what instruments to use. See? It tells us what instruments to use, but it doesn't play the instruments for us. It doesn't import the instruments in for us. So what we have to do as producers is to import instruments to play the sounds, and we can literally use any sounds that we have at our disposal. So in Ableton, we have, let's use some stock Ableton instruments for the melody. So this is the grand piano. The grand piano is in every version of Ableton. So listen to this without it. We're gonna turn this off. Let's press play. There's nothing. The instrument's still going. It's still playing the notes. Now let's turn this on and hear what it sounds like. Okay. Now, the really cool thing about this is we can use other instruments. It's not dictating. You see how this says this Nexus? This is another plugin that can be used. So what we also can do, though, is we can use different sounds. So I'm going to use a different sound here. Let's just check this out. See how it sounds. If we were doing like an old school 2008 beat, that probably would work. I personally think it sounds best with that grand piano, but you understand the idea and the concept. So the rest of these that contain drum information, if you notice, a drum, like everything else, can still be tuned. So you can play a drum note at a lower note. Let's check this out. You can still play this sound as a different type of note, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to populate these drum sounds by themselves. And let's hear how the drums sound. Let's turn off the melody and listen to the drums themselves. And then we'll add in the 808 bass, and then we'll create our own pattern. Okay. All right. So if you notice right here, there's the drums are not playing because the first couple of measures of the song do not have any drums in them. Okay. Okay, let's add in our bass. you see how all this information is contained? Like this bass line moves up and down in the scale and plays different pitches. This is not like the audio loop where you can change the pitch for the whole loop at the same time. You have to, in MIDI, you have the ability to actually play it out along a musical scale. With an audio clip, these right here are the audio clips. So check this out. If I put this sound in here by itself, it opens up this audio clip, right? You can still see it and still edit it. But in the MIDI tracks, we use different types of instruments to manipulate the audio. So now we can manipulate the audio. Okay. And just because I know certain folks in my class are going to want you to play this beat, we're going to play it out a little bit just so you can hear it all together. And we'll solo certain elements out just to hear how it sounds. Okay. So you see where I was able to manipulate certain sounds while the track was playing, because this is still an instrument. So we can tune the instruments. All right. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to open MIDI tracks. So to do that on the keyboard, it's Command Shift T. And that's to bring up a MIDI track. So what I want you to do, if you're following along, Command Shift T to bring up two MIDI tracks. We're going to do one drum rack here, and we're going to do one drum rack here. And then once we get our drums done, we're going to drop in a melody in an audio track, and we're going to drop in a bass. And then on our lesson on Wednesday, we're going to use what is called the piano rack, which we're going to talk about in the drum, to create our own separate MIDI tracks to construct a more complex instrumental. Let's begin. So, what you need to do to bring up a drum rack, mine is a little different because I have customized all of my Ableton preferences for myself. But this is the same in every version of Ableton, is to go to drums. You're going to go on the side. If this is closed, go to this arrow here, open up the file browser, go to drums, and open up the drum rack. Just double click on that and bring up an empty drum rack. I'll bring up mine right here, and it will look like this. Nothing in it. See, there's empty cells. There's nothing we can play here. If you look here, there's nothing that can be played. Nothing that can be played. Great. So let's change that. So I'm going to include these drum sounds in the media file link, or the file link that is up on this video, so that you can follow along using the drum sounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the drum sounds that we used in the earlier portion of the video. So to populate this rack, you open up the folder where your drum sounds are, select the drum sound, and drag it down into the rack. So select the sound, do not double click it, just click it with your mouse, hold it, click down on your mouse, and drag it down. And what we're going to do is, typically, the way that we assign this is we put kick drum first, then we put a snare or a clap, then we're going to put hi-hats, open hats, and other sounds. So let's do this. So this is the kick drum. Go up here to the snare, drag that down here. Go down to the clap. We're going to drag this down here. All right. The only thing that we're not going to place in here is this 808. We're going to place the 808 over here in its own drum rack. Just to show, whoa. So we're gonna make another drum rack, go back to drums. And this is for me. We're gonna click drum rack. I go back to my drums. I'm gonna put my 808 right here. Okay, so let's rename our tracks. Remember, Command R or Control R on your keyboard. And we're gonna call this drums. And we're gonna call this bass. All right. So we have a kick. We're missing a sound, our open hat. Okay. So check this out. What we're going to do now is we're going to create, we can either turn on our keyboard function where we can play on our keyboard. The way to do that is to go up here to the top row and press this thing that looks like a piano. And that allows us to make our computer keyboard into a keyboard that can play the notes. So if I turn this on and I'm going to press Z on my keyboard to change the octave, I can play the sounds now. So I could play out my own drum pattern. I don't necessarily care for that because it's hard for me on my keyboard to play out a pattern. So what I like to do is I like to create a MIDI clip and then do what is called drawing in a MIDI clip. So to do that, we're going to highlight a cell. So check this row. We're going to highlight a cell. Left click. And then we're going to select Insert MIDI Clip. If you notice, it says Shift Command M. So on your keyboard, Shift Control M on PC. Shift Command M. There we go. Look at that. Or Insert MIDI Clip. Okay. So this brings up this MIDI note editor mode. And if you notice, because we populated it, it tells us what sounds we have in here. So we have this kick, we have the snare, we have the clap, the hat, and open hat. We also have the loop. It's the same as the audio. We have this loop bar here. Start and end point that allows us to change the start and end points. We have the ability to duplicate the loop that we create, to change programs, to change the time signature. We also had this in audio editing. And then we also have the MIDI envelopes, which change the MIDI note behavior. We can pitch blend and change things on the fly, which works really well with basses. And we're not going to do that in this lesson because what I would like you to focus on today is creating a simple drum pattern that works for you. You want a drum pattern that makes sense, and you want a drum pattern that is going to complement any melody that you choose. So we're going to create, I call this the pop hip hop, trap hip hop 101 drum pattern. This works every single time. It's simple, but you can also make it a little bit more movement. You can create more movement by just changing a couple of things. So first things first, we want to choose our tempo. I'm going to choose 130 because it's between the fast tempos of 160 and the slow tempos of 120. And then I'm going to start with a couple of things. First things first, we want to change the length of this clip. We don't want this to be 1 bar. 1 bar is too short for us to get our idea done. So typically what I like to do is to make this 4 bars. So I'll go to this length part right here, type in 4, and then that gives me the ability for me to have a larger clip. I'm going to go into this note mode. If this pencil does not pop up for you, press B. And I'm going to change my fixed grid. I'm going to change this to 1/4 because the first thing we want to do is we want to start out with the larger note values and then get smaller as we are creating. Okay, so a number of my students always complain to me, Mr. Charles, I don't like creating with this metronome on. I don't like that sound. It's annoying to me and it causes me to get a headache or get tired of creating my beat. And I would say to my students, well, the first thing you need to do is just create your clap and your hi-hat, because the clap and the hi-hat are going to dictate what happens in the rest of your track anyway as far as rhythm is concerned. So in popular R&B, hip-hop, contemporary music in 2020, this is the most popular pattern. You put your snares and your claps on the 0.3. Every third measure, every third beat comes a clap. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. See? When you're trying to give it a little bit of spice, you're going to add in, you know, late notes. But if we're going to do something that just makes sense out the box, you're trying to get to something that sounds good. Okay. Yeah, see? All right. So to draw these notes, B, bring up the pencil, select the cell you want. Just click in the cell. Click in the cell. And now we don't need the metronome on. Okay. So we're going to layer this together so we can have a strong drum layer. Okay. Now what we're going to do is, because we're going to come back to this, we're going to add in some triplet notes. So go to this grid. Look at this. Press triplet. All right. And then what I'm going to do is change the note value to 1/8. Actually, let's turn off this triplet. If you notice, look at the note value I've chosen. 3, 4, 3, right? So these are still on those 0.3 notes. Okay. So let's take out some of these, because it doesn't need to be this doesn't need to be the whole pattern. So let's just delete this. Okay. That's a good pattern. So let's just make this simpler. See how that sounds nice? It goes around, it has a little bit of spice to it. So let's make this simple. Let's go back to, so what we're doing is I'm left clicking, fix grid. Now the hi-hats. we can do a simple 1/8 pattern. Check how this sounds. Let's bring back that hat bounce in. Okay. It's got a nice pattern to it. So the open hat just comes in on that last fourth note. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? All right, and then finally our kick drums. The kick drums, I like to have a little bit more rhythm to them. So let's put on 1/16 and just place the kick at the 1. And the kick's going to come at 0.2. So divisions of 0.2. All right, that's a little bit too much bounce. Okay. All right, that's a little too much, so let's bring this together. Bring that one back a tad. All right, there we go. We have a simple drum beat. That's it. Look at that. So we have a drum beat. Let's drop a bass in here. So remember, left click, insert MIDI clip, or Control-Shift-M, or Command-Shift-M if you're on Mac. The bass is even easier. The bass we're going to leave at 2 bars. And let's just draw the bass in. So the bass is a melodic instrument technically. So for the bass to play out, if you notice in the drum rack, there's this simpler. This is what's called a simpler. We'll go over this in our next tutorial. The simpler note needs to be stretched out. So when we put a note in here, notice how it doesn't fill the whole thing. So the way to stretch a note out is if we hover over the end, this bracket shows up and we can press on it and stretch the note. So let's stretch this note out. All right, right here, bass. Simple bass beat. Now we can just go find a melody track. Let's go in here and go find a melody. Okay, this is interesting. Okay. Just like that, we have a fully fleshed out loop idea. We created a drum rack, made our own notes, and watch what happens. If I delete this drum rack, I'm gonna duplicate this. If I delete this drum rack and play this, press stop here and play. Stop everything. Nothing plays. But we still have the note information here. See? So we can export this clip and then use these drums in another track. So next lesson, we're going to talk about how to utilize and manipulate MIDI clips that are already created and then creating more complex MIDI clips. Thank you so much for joining us today. Stay upbeat.